became friends with him for the most part.
Tom had another.
I don't want to hog everything, but I'd like to change the course just a second, since we're involved in a presidential election coming up pretty quick. Could you make some comments or some pros and cons or some opinions on the presidents that you worked for when you worked in the White House?
The presidents that I worked for, well, thank you, Tom, that's a good question. When I left the government service in 1993, I had worked for almost a quarter of all the presidents this country had in its entire history. Which one was my favorite? Harry Truman. Harry Truman saved my life by dropping the bomb because, as Tom indicated, there was no conceivable way that the landing echelon that I was going to be in on November 1st, 1945, could escape being wiped out. In fact, they had two echelons. The echelon I would have been in was duplicated by a second echelon, had exactly the same loads because they thought we were going to be wiped out, and we would have been wiped out almost to the man. So Truman, when we first got our op plans for the landing, it was called Operation Olympic, I looked at the intelligence annex and I almost heaved because I said, I just turned 23 and I had 3.5 months to live. It was like being on death row until the bomb was dropped. So he was my favorite, but also, even more, that was a very personal thing. Not only did he save probably hundreds of thousands of American lives, the Japanese, that's before we dropped the bomb, estimated that when we landed in Japan, it would probably cost the Japanese about 20 million killed in action, 20 million Japanese deaths, as opposed to 128 million from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So, but the main thing that I credit Truman for is saving Western Europe from communism, because he's the one who supported the Marshall Plan and supported all of the operations that we had, which were staving off an expansion of communist power into Western Europe. And also, I gave him great credit for declaring war when the North Koreans attacked the South Koreans. Had we not got in war to protect South Korea, this would have led to a series of potentially disastrous miscalculations on the part of the Soviets and others. So he had a lot of nerve, and he was a plain-spoken character, and he was my favorite. Now I'm talking about my first president I served under was Franklin Roosevelt as a naval officer. I go back then. My next favorite president was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, I had some personal contact with. I was working on Soviet Eastern European affairs under Ronald Reagan. He, more than anybody else, is responsible for ending the Cold War by his policies of building up our arms strength and switching from containment to actually a more aggressive approach to the Soviet bloc. So he set in motion a chain of events which ultimately led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. So those are my two favorites. The others are varying degrees. Favorites are Jimmy Carter and Lyndon B. Johnson were my two least favorites, I might say. But the others are varied. I think that Gerald Ford and Bush Sr. are underrated. They're better presidents than they're being given credit for. Oh, the one we liked, I mean, those of us in government service, that we really, sorry, say again? Oh yeah, the one that we liked, particularly those of us in the State Department at the time, was Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was kind of a fun president. He was a disaster in his first year, an unmitigated disaster. I'm one of the few people alive today that was privy to what went on in his first meeting with Khrushchev, and that was a shocker, and it led to a whole lot of real serious problems, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he had a lot of charm. He was a great speaker. And what we liked about him in the State Department is if we wanted to find the answer to something, he would not call the Secretary of State, which is a chain of command. He'd call the desk officer. Well, the first desk officer I know of that got that call, I said, yeah, if you're the president, I'm little orphan Annie or some aleck report. And then the pause, and the president, Kennedy had a good sense of humor, and said, well, this is the president. And the poor guy was nonplussed and very apologetic. But nevertheless, and that sort of got around. And, we liked having the president come down to us, who were the experts, rather than go through the Secretary of State. That was kind of flattering. He also saved the career of one of my fellow Foreign Service officers. He was, this officer opened up our mission in Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda. And he was living over a butcher shop and under very primitive conditions. And he sent out a hilarious telegram called, they were all numbered, he's called Kigali 14. And the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Soapy Williams, was very solicitous of his newly independent African countries, and he was furious. Big Manby is this officer, and he was going to ruin his career. He said, this is outrageous, making fun of, one of my new African countries. And my poor Manby was, his career was on the line. In fact, it was about to end. And Williams got a call from the president and said, Soapy, have you read Kigali 14? And Williams said, yes, sir, Mr. President, I certainly have. And the president said, that is a great piece of reporting. I want to see you take care of that, officer. I want more reporting like this. And saved his life. Well, there's a little sequel to this. I always wondered how on earth, of all the thousands of telegrams that come into the Washington every day, how did Kigali 14 ever get to the president? Well, we were at a reception for a bunch of retired Foreign Service officers. We were sitting at a table, and the former ambassador sat down, and he explained how he had sent this, he was in one of the African desks, he had sent this over to the White House, to the NSC, contacting you. He contacts us, the president's going to get a kick out of this, and send it up to him. So I found out years and years later how I ever got Kigali 14. Well, anyway, that's a long, it's a good question. I'm glad to have that chance to elaborate, but so that's about my assessment of presidents. As I said, I like Reagan as a great personality. Nixon I found hard to figure out. I didn't have much personal contact with him, but he seemed kind of uptight. Of course, this is after the only time I really had any conversation with him was after the Watergate disaster. But and George Bush Sr., the only thing he would want to talk about is learning to fly in a Stearman in wintertime. And so that's the only conversation we ever had was he had said, oh, you're Bill Stearman. Well, and he'd start talking about his days in the Stearman, which. But, well, anyway, are there any more questions? Yes, sir.
When was your first ride in the PT-17, and what did you do with it after that?
When did I first fly in the PT-17?
And what did you do?
Was right here at the fly-in, And I don't know if you took me